How's everyone doing this evening? Or at least for me, it's evening. Maybe for you, it's not. Hey, welcome. Say hi if you're joining live. And let us know how you're doing and maybe from where in the world you are joining. Awesome. Cool. So today we are chatting about being an emotional athlete as a clinician. I find this a really interesting topic. And yeah, I'd love to know just before we even get started, I'll wait a few seconds, but tell me how that idea feels. Like if you think about yourself as an emotional athlete and not an athlete that's very emotional, that can be as well, but that you have a high load of emotional work as a clinician. And so thinking of it as being an athlete, thinking of it as I'm working really hard in this domain in my life. And if I think of myself as an athlete, what changes? So if you think of yourself as an athlete, an emotional athlete, right? It can also be mental athlete, right? We have also a very high mental load as clinicians. I think for me, at least, I find clinicians are a bit more aware of the mental load than the emotional load or the components of the emotional load. But those of us who are also manual therapists have also a high physical load, right? We are also physical athletes. So just thinking about what does that idea kind of bring up for you? Like if you had to think of yourself as an emotional athlete, what does that bring up for you? And you can let us know in the comments, maybe also let us know, like, is there anything that you would immediately think of changing if you really thought of yourself as an athlete? Is there anything in your habits, your lifestyle, your approach that would change if you thought of yourself this way? And just let us know in the comments. All right. So just to introduce myself, I'm Sarah. I'm a health and career coach for clinicians. And this is, I think, one of the biggest topics that I think is important to discuss when it comes to being a healthcare provider, because it's something that we're not necessarily aware of. And it is just such a huge part of our job that we really need to be taking it seriously. And I think that's maybe one of the biggest like factors or components in thinking of ourselves as emotional athletes is just how do we maybe take that aspect a bit more seriously? How do we really honor the fact that we have a really high emotional load? How do we really take care of ourselves in that domain? So just thinking of, what would I do differently, right? You can also, if the idea of being an athlete doesn't resonate with you as much, you can also think of it as being an asset, right? So your brain and your emotional capacity, your emotional skills, these are all assets that we have. That is what we work with, right? And we need to be taking care of it from that viewpoint, right? So if we think about, the idea of being an asset or an athlete, right? Let's think about a physical athlete, right? So let's say a professional athlete in the usual sort of use of that word. If they had to, come home and keep on training the way that they were doing at work, right? Or if they had to ignore their sleep or ignore their nutrition or ignore other types of movements, hey, Fiona, ignore other components, we would think that kind of strange of a physical athlete. And yet, as clinicians, we have such a high emotional load at work, and often we're just getting home and doing the exact same thing at home, right? We have this thing of, taking care of the rest of the people in our lives. We kind of transfer that role that we have as a clinician to our roles at home. And so thinking about what are the actual emotional stresses or the emotional load that we have at work. And again, thinking about the fact that stresses are not necessarily, firstly, something that stresses you out. It's just something that is a load, so something that is demanding of you, right? If you think about a workout, you are using up resources. There are things being demanded of you to do a workout, but it's not necessarily stressful for you. So don't only think of it as what stresses me out. When you think of stresses, think of that more in the like physiological sense, right? So the physiological stresses that we have, sorry, there's another point I was wanting to make in that. Oh, and then not thinking about stresses as necessarily bad, right? We're not trying to always get rid of stresses or never have stresses or never have load, right? Most of the meaningful things in our lives are in some form or another stresses or load, right? So we're not trying to think about these emotional stresses as things that necessarily stress us out or as something that's bad and needs to be removed, right? It's just, what is the emotional load that you have when you're working as a healthcare provider? So these are a few things, right? There's the emotional labor of, in some sense, managing your patient's emotions. So if they come to you and they're having a horrible day, we need to be able to kind of have that space for them to have those emotions. And sometimes we're trying to help them calm down. Sometimes we're helping them to feel more hope. Sometimes we're helping them, just to encourage them or whatever the case is. But we're often playing a role in like helping them feel a certain way. And when we think about managing our own emotions, one of the aspects of that is we put on, hey Matt, we put on a certain face, right? So if you're having a crap day, if you are not feeling great, there's a certain kind of face that you put on when you go to work, and that is emotional labor. So we need to be recognizing that load, that emotional load when we are working as clinicians. So there's the emotional labor of being a clinician, right? So one of the things that I just wanted to touch on is we often think about this as compassion fatigue. And I think the idea is a bit misleading just because it creates this idea that firstly, compassion is something that we need to avoid, right? Because if we do it too much, we're going to burn out, we're going to have compassion fatigue, and that's not actually true. The other thing about that is compassion is actually something that is protective against burnout, right? So, and against exhaustion. So compassion is just that kind of warm, loving, kind of moving towards feeling when someone is suffering. So when someone is struggling or suffering, we are kind of there witnessing it with a sense of kind of love. Not in the, I mean, sometimes it sounds weird to think of loving your patients. To some people, not at all, but to some people that might feel a bit strange, but that's that kind of warm feeling as in like, I'm here for you. If I could take this away, I would, but it's just kind of a warm feeling in the presence of someone else's suffering. What actually is what we call then compassion fatigue is actually what they call empathic distress fatigue. So actually what's happening is that person is struggling and suffering, and you are suffering as a result of their suffering. So you are experiencing a level of distress at their suffering. And that is usually what burns us out. And that's actually empathic distress fatigue is probably a more accurate term than compassion fatigue. So just know that just caring about someone is not something that's going to burn you out, right? That can actually be really helpful against burnout, and it can create a deeper sense of meaning. Like, this is why I do the work that I do, right? Okay, so if we are thinking about ourselves as emotional athletes, right? We have this load at work where we are sometimes performing certain emotions, or we're helping other people manage their emotions. then the idea is like, how are we recovering from that, right? Resting and recovering. So like I said, not just getting home and doing the exact same thing at home, right? So if you have to put on a certain face at work, you want at least a period of time to recover from that, to be able to express your emotions freely without having any sense of, I need to be putting on a certain face at home as well. Obviously, there will be limitations to that. It's not like at home, you must just be able to do whatever. And at work, you must, control yourself. It's more like to have some outlet for those emotions that you maybe couldn't express during your day, right? So some idea of not just carrying on that emotional load at home, just like a professional athlete wouldn't just get home and carry on training. And then, like I mentioned, kind of the surrounding things, right? Sleep, nutrition, other forms of movement, right? Those are all helpful in managing our emotions, in being emotionally regulated. So we need to be prioritizing that and taking that as seriously as a professional physical athlete would. And then thinking about activating our sense of meaning, right? So that same idea behind compassion, but when we are performing emotional labor at work, or we have a high emotional load, the more we connect to the deeper meaning behind that. Like, why is it meaningful for me to do that? They call this deep acting. So we're not just superficially acting out these things because we feel like, oh, I have to put on a certain level of professionality, or like a certain face, only this is acceptable at work, and we're kind of superficially acting that out. But we want to change that to deep acting. So deep acting meaning we want to genuinely connect with some or other meaning within ourselves that makes us genuinely want to produce that emotion, or genuinely want to put on that face at work, right? Because we know what it's actually doing. We know why it's helpful for our patients, and we genuinely want to do that out of a sense of meaning. So they find that people who are superficially acting burn out. It's a much higher risk factor for burning out, whereas when you are acting from a deeper place, from a place of meaning, you don't have that same elevated risk of burnout. So that's something really interesting to consider. So reconnecting to meaning and purpose in your work. And then having boundaries, the hardest thing ever for us as clinicians. So boundaries between work and home, right? So when I get home, what is my boundary, right? For some people that, especially as an introvert, it's when I get home, please do not talk to me for a certain amount of time, right? Or maybe, like I said, there's a boundary between, okay, I need some time at home where I can just say stuff, and, maybe your partner just, listens and doesn't judge you for all the stuff that you just want to let out. Or you say leave me alone, I'm going to go dance in my room for half an hour, or whatever it is, some form of boundaries of, this is the emotional load that I had at work, and now I'm getting home, and there's a clear stopping of that, or some break or rest or recovery from that. A break from your identities and roles, right? So not being the clinician. This is one of the classic struggles of us as clinicians, going to a party and someone wants to talk to you about their knee pain, and so it's that kind of idea, right? Not in our group of friends always being the person that has to listen to everybody else. Having some sort of boundary around, this is when I'm acting as a clinician, and then it's my personal time, and I don't need to be performing that emotional labor in every role and every domain in my life. And then just the idea of thinking about a professional athlete, really make sure that they're not overtraining, right? So just the overall volume and load on them, they are regulating that. They know that if they just train the whole day, that's not going to be productive. So you can think about, especially if you are emotionally fatigued and exhausted, think about whether for you, and this is different for every person, right? We all, I know, Matt, you have a very specific, this is how many patients I can see in a day, and that is it for me, right? And I think we all have that, and it can be very different from one person to the other. Again, for me, someone who's very introverted, I would rather see people for a much longer period of time, but very few in a day. With my coaching, I see maybe 2 people a day, and that's for me perfect, but it's much longer sessions, right? So for me, that's much more manageable in terms of emotional load, but everyone has a difference in that. But just realizing that you might just be overtraining when it comes to emotional load, right? It might just be volume wise far too much for you to actually handle. Okay, so thinking about that, almost like capacity and load, we can either decrease the load or we can increase the capacity. So decreasing load would be the things like boundaries, things like maybe decreasing how many patients you see, maybe decreasing or converting essentially the superficial acting to deep acting, right? And then capacity-wise, maybe there's the nutrition, the sleep, the deep social connections, right? All the things that would recover and replenish your source of like emotional capacity. You can think of the other side of that equation. I'm gonna grab some water. Hi, Elmarie. So let me know what you guys are resonating with and just anything that comes up for you as we're kind of talking about these ideas. I just realized I was like in it and talking and I'm like, okay, take a break. Okay, cool. So then the other part of that is if you are an athlete, right, you are not only looking at your load and recovering, but you also are always training your skills, right? If you're an athlete, you're working on all the skills that are involved in your sport, right? So the same thing for us. We are emotional athletes. We are performing emotional labor at work. We have to have certain skills, like this can include self-awareness, right? Awareness of your habitual patterns when it comes to emotions, right? Your awareness of certain just general emotions. Are you able to name them? Things like being able to express our emotions and talk about our emotions. Things like adaptive coping, so not running away from emotions or labeling them as like good and bad, or numbing out, distracting ourselves. So how are we coping, right? Adaptive coping with our emotions, not being reactive the whole time with emotional states, like that idea of creating space for your patient to have whatever emotional reaction they want to have, to not that they can just say whatever to you and you can't have boundaries around that, but more just they are expressing how they feel without you just emotionally taking that on or just reacting as soon as you hear that, right? There's some sort of distance. You are aware of your thoughts and your emotions and your natural patterns, and you don't act from the space of just reacting and taking things personally. So you are essentially like a leader in that way, right? You are leading in that space. You don't just have to be kind of pulled around with whatever the patient is thinking and feeling and saying. So have some sort of kind of leadership in that space. And then just in general, thinking about like, is your own emotional space taken care of? Right. So are you doing things in your life that are emotionally nourishing? Are you taking care of your own emotional needs? Are you seeking sources of joy and fulfillment and creativity, whatever it is that you want from life? Are you seeking that also in other places and not relying on your career or your patients to provide that? And this is something that can get quite tricky, right? Especially to admit that we do this, right? But think about this. Are you needing something emotionally from your patients? Are you relying on them for validation, for appreciation? Do you rely on them to get better so that you feel like you are, doing meaningful work, right? So just thinking about like, is our emotional space taken care of? Or are we relying on work or our patients to kind of fulfill some kind of emotional need? And this is not to say that work can't be emotionally replenishing or joyful or a source of meaning or, something that makes you happy. That is not what I'm saying. It's more that as a general kind of base, we have a very strong emotional base we are taking care of. And then if a patient is appreciative, it's like a cherry on the top, right? If we have this amazing patient who we just have so much fun with, cherry on the top, right? So it's not that you are relying on the patients for some kind of emotional need of your own. And that's a really tricky one, especially because, I mean, there's sort of like a running joke of, if you were the parentified child growing up, like, how's your profession in healthcare going? But it's just sort of this idea that a lot of people get into healthcare because they have this kind of need to help in a way that's not always healthy. It's often in a way that's like, I need to help to feel good about myself. I need to help you. Or sometimes there's like this feeling of fixing, right? So I'm going to fix this. I'm going to make everything right. And there's this kind of emotional, in some sense, reliance on how your patients are responding to you, are appreciating you, are responding to your care, right? So it's just something to think about. We always think of helping and overgiving and things as almost like as just noble things, right? Like we'll say, oh, I shouldn't do that, or but we'll put it as like, we kind of see that there's some, like, maybe I'll be tired, or I'll be exhausted, or that's the same thing, tired, or that there are negative consequences. But mostly we have this like secret thing of like, it's actually really noble that I'm like overgiving and needing to help people, and but they are really there's like a very dark underbelly to that, which if we're not aware of it, we can really get sucked into that. And it's that same idea of like, I'm just too nice, right? We just think about it as like, some people are just really nice and they're just nicer than other people. And framing it as being nice can often make us not really want to change it, or like I said, kind of, we just secretly think that it's really noble. When actually it's a lot of like there's a lot of dysfunctional patterns. And you can identify what the difference is, firstly by, are you resentful? That's a very quick way. If you're resentful, that is not true kindness or true helping. That is like, I feel like I have to do this, and then I'm resentful that I have to do that. So that's one way, just to look at whether you are resentful. That's what I was going to say about the other one. Anyway, it'll come back to me. If you watch my lives, this happens quite a bit. I'll like, want to go on this train and that train of thought. Okay, cool. So that leads me into the barriers, right? Because it's not enough to just say, oh, you need to treat yourself like an athlete and an asset, and you need to take that seriously, and you need to put boundaries down, and you need to recover, and you need to prioritize your sleep and all those things, right? We need to be aware of what are the barriers, because most of us know that even if we don't necessarily frame it the way that I'm framing it as like an emotional athlete or asset, we generally know that some things need to happen or change, or we need to prioritize certain things, but it's very difficult for us to do that. So that might be one of them, right? That kind of people pleasing, or I'm too nice. Oh, that was what I was going to say. The other way that you can tell whether it's people pleasing or genuine kindness is like how much you feel you actually have control over that, right? So if you're like, I could say no, I could put down a boundary, or I could say yes, and I could do this thing. And either way, like, I'm fine sort of either way. I'm able to do both, but I'm choosing to help or to say yes or whatever it is, right? Versus usually what's happening is like, we literally feel like we couldn't say no even if we tried. Like we physically, emotionally, mentally feel incapable of setting that boundary, of saying no, right? So that's another way that you can sort of think about it. If it was a voluntary thing, then sure, it's noble. If that's not, again, leading to resentment or leading to your own burnout, right? It's unhealthy when we are prioritizing others' needs over our own in a very habitual, automatic, and sort of chronic way. Like that's just our default, right? It's not that in certain circumstances, when it's appropriate, which is very healthy, we sometimes have to put other people's needs before our own. But when it's all the time and it's sort of out of your control, that's a very different thing. Okay, where was I when I... Okay, so in general, barriers, right? So if you think of, let's just pick one thing, right? So if you think about our discussion of how you might recover better as an emotional athlete, how you might maybe train better or get more skills as an emotional athlete, think about if you had to do that thing, right? So let's say, for example, it's going to bed half an hour earlier, or maybe it is setting a boundary at work, or maybe it is decreasing the amount of patients you see, or maybe it's when you're getting home, you are having or you have a conversation with your partner about, when I get home, this is what I need, right? If you think about doing that, if you really kind of properly imagine that in your mind, what resistance comes up? What feels like, oh no, or like, yeah, some kind of ugh or resistance, or yeah, some sort of barrier to doing that. And that's where we can usually identify why we're actually struggling to do it. And that is a very important component of behavior change. A lot of us think, you know, all I have to know is that I should do this, and then I should just like willpower my way through that. And sometimes that works temporarily, but usually unless we figure out, okay, I genuinely want to understand why I have trouble doing this, right? Going from the assumption that my behavior makes sense, it makes sense that I'm scared to put down a boundary, right? There's not something wrong with me. I'm not dysfunctional in some way. It makes sense that that is hard for me. Let me figure out why. Let me figure out, what do I think is going to happen if I set that boundary? What am I dreading? What am I worrying about? And often your behavior becomes seems a lot more logical when you've identified those barriers and the resistance. And one of the things is like the identity around that, right? Like if you are asking for certain things because you are looking at yourself as now an asset or an athlete, you're like taking that seriously, right? It can be like, you know, this idea of like, people will think, who does she think she is, right? It can be something like that, or that people will think you're selfish because you are putting down boundaries, or you're asking for certain things, or you don't want to see a patient after this time, right? So the unwanted identities around that can often be really strong. Selfish, lazy, don't care, you know, this person that thinks she's all that, all of those kinds of things. And then it can be also barriers like certainty, right? So if we think, you know, taking less patients, or not taking patients after a certain time, or like, you know, if we had a certain period that we decided these are hours and I'm not going to take anyone outside of these hours, but then someone phones and we're like, oh, you know, so like thinking about that, we might think of that as it's providing less certainty if I say no, because I don't know if that person's still going to want to book. I don't know if my practice is going to fail. I'm going to end up living on the street, right? We often go to like the worst case scenario. But there can be a sense of like, at least this way, I'm certain that I'm bringing in money, right? Whereas I don't know if I sort of put down those boundaries, rest and recover more, all those things, whether I'm going to have that certainty. So there can be different barriers, and it's different for each person. But try and identify like, what is the internal resistance that you have in response to the specific thing that you've chosen. And you can use that specific thing as maybe that's the thing you try out for a while and just see how it goes. You can always use kind of a very small version of that, right? Like it could be, if you're wanting to go to bed earlier, right? It could be just 5 minutes. It could be 10 minutes, right? It could be like I'm going to set my alarm for when I should go to bed. Even if I don't go to bed early at that time, it's just to like start to get used to that, right? It can always be very small steps, particularly if you feel quite like a strong resistance to it or a strong dread about it, or you think something really bad is going to happen. You can always start really small, but just try out some kind of small action step this week. And I'd love to know what it is and how it's going. I will also post an assessment in the comments. That's particularly in the Facebook group. So it'll be an assessment on emotional competence. And it's just kind of like around our emotional skills, right? Do you have various emotional skills that you need as an emotional athlete? And it can just be a really good starting point. And even just the questions themselves can guide you as like, oh, these are emotional skills, because often we just not even aware of it, right? It goes under the whole long list of things I never learned at university. And then the other thing is like, if you think of a professional athlete, they also have things like coaches and mentors and role models and support in like almost every domain in that sport, right? So you can think of it in the same way, right? Where are you getting your support as a clinician, right? And one of the ways that you might want to do that is through coaching. So if that is something that you are interested in, having some kind of support, someone who understands the emotional load of being a clinician and the struggles, and then also understands recovery and rest and stress management, a lot of that will kind of go into the way that we coach together. So emotional labor and recovery is a big part of that. And then we know we have all the other aspects of your health, not only emotional, mental, existential, relational, physical, right? So all the aspects of your health, and then also designing your career journey. So making sure that you actually are on the path that feels the most meaningful to you, right? Because that's often kind of like that superficial and deep acting, right? If we don't plug into a source of meaning in our career, all the emotional labor that we're doing can feel kind of like just wasted energy. Something that I just have to do because it's my job. Whereas if we have that deeper sense of meaning in our career, that will allow us to be at much lower risk of burning out and just generally, feel better about our careers. So meaning is a huge part of that, and also just, creating work that is really utilizing your strengths and your interests, because that can often be a part where we're performing emotional labor, almost like pretending to care about something that we maybe don't care about and it's not that interesting to us, right? Or you just don't have the particular, not through any fault of your own necessarily, but just that you are not that interested in those particular skills, right? So, for example, for me, like I really love the side of like communicating, of having those conversations, of helping people make changes, whereas some other clinicians might love the sort of physical treatment aspect and be like, oh, I don't want to have to like have those conversations with my patients. So sometimes it's more basing what you focus on as, where your strengths lie, and then also in the areas that you may need someone to help you with the skills, you can build those skills in other areas. So the emotional skills, emotional regulation and coping and managing that sort of emotional load, those are all skills that you can learn. They're not things that just you either have or you don't, right? So if you'd like to consider someone supporting you in that, helping you, coaching you through that as an athlete would have, let me know in the comments. You can just, actually you can DM me. I think that will be easier. And you can just type athlete in the DM and you can get in touch with me and we can talk about that. We'll hop on a call to discuss it. Awesome. Have a great evening. And I'm going to be hopping over to the clinician gathering soon. So I hope I will see some of you there. That's particularly for the lady clinicians. We get together on Saturday evenings South African time, 7 p.m. And we discuss all these kinds of things, right? The emotional aspects, the mental aspects, the more like personal side of being a clinician. and we get to share our stories and explore that a little bit more, explore those kind of deeper things that I kind of think about as like just having DMCs with other clinicians, deep, meaningful convos, which is, at least to me, my favorite form of socializing. So I hope I will see you guys there, and let me know if you want those details, and I'll chat to you guys soon. Cheers.